Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and I'm excited because we're moving right along in our series on documentaries. Today, I'm speaking with executive producer and civil rights attorney, Andy Hale. And if you're wondering how a practicing attorney becomes a filmmaker, well, you're going to hear all about it. And I'm just so excited because there's actually a handful of docs that Andy has produced. And I didn't get to watch them all because, a woman only has so much time. I lament to say I can't watch all the true crime docs that I would like to in a certain period of time, but I did my best. So we do focus mostly on White Boy.
So it's really a story about, kind of the war on drugs. How could a juvenile at 17 for a nonviolent drug offense get life in prison when there's people killing people and murdering people that are doing 20 years, 15 years?
And A Murder in the Park. And I'm especially excited about those two in particular. One covers a wrongful conviction story, and the other is about a minor who's an FBI informant and a non-violent drug offender who gets a life sentence. You'll hear a lot more about both stories, and you'll also get to hear a short trailer for each within our conversation. So if you haven't yet seen these films, not only will you get to hear from Andy, one of the executive producers, but you'll also get to hear a little clip, which I am certain will make you want to watch the whole thing. And if you've seen these movies, then you're in for a treat because you get some backstory and kind of hearing how Andy came to be involved in both projects. Also, Andy has two news stories in the works, which he shares later in the conversation, so even more to get excited about. I'm thrilled to have had Andy on with his legal expertise, his point of view on policing and race relations and drug offenses. We really covered it all. These are two true crime documentaries, but as is always the case, or very often the case, they touch on a lot of themes and subjects that are often found at the heart of true crime stories that go into much more societal and cultural topics, and that's what we love to do here on Dialogue. So Andy and I sure did kill the small talk, and not for nothing, this is a great conversation on following your curiosity, which that's my thing, right? You just never know where it's going to lead, and Andy's story is just a beautiful example of that. So please enjoy these two documentaries, which I hope you'll watch. I will link to them in the show notes. They're available on multiple platforms, including Netflix and Amazon Prime and YouTube. And enjoy the conversation with Andy Hale. Okay, Andy Hale, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm thrilled that we are able to connect to talk today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So I'm bringing you on in the series we're doing on documentaries, but you are a lawyer by trade. And so talk to me about, first of all, how a lawyer is also a producer of film, and which came first. I'd love to hear your professional background.
It's funny. You never really know where the road is going to take you, is what I say. I've been practicing law for over 30 years, and this film part is a more recent development. It's funny how this goes, and I'm a big believer in you create your own opportunities. I feel that so strongly, and the way this all came about was I had a woman from your neck of the woods develop my website. She was from New York. She said, "You really should get a Facebook page." This is 15 years ago, probably. So we were giving out some kind of police-related wristbands as a giveaway on our Facebook page. This woman writes in for one, and she mentions in her email, her tagline was Crime Stoppers Case Files TV show. Okay. So let's pause there. I could have just sent her the wristband and just, sent her on her merry way. But I was intrigued. So I wrote back and I said, "Oh, what's Crime Stoppers Case Files?" So I engaged with her and I started this conversation. Turns out that was a local TV show here in Chicago that would profile 2 unsolved murders every week. And then they'd interview a detective, the family, and they'd have a tip line, okay? So I was really intrigued by that. I thought that was cool. So I reached out to the guy who owned the show. He's based in Cleveland. His name was Sean Reck. I became an advertiser. My law firm became an advertiser on the show. Fast forward about a year, he was running this show in several markets, LA, Cleveland, Chicago, Miami. And he said, "Hey, Andy, are you interested? I'll sell you the Chicago show if you want to have it." So I wind up buying essentially the Chicago show and ran that for, another 6 years. And through that, so that was a TV show called Case File Chicago that was on in Chicago locally, trying to solve unsolved murders. Where I'm going with all this is, but I met Sean Reck through this process. And when I heard about this case with Al Story Simon, which became the documentary A Murder in the Park, I couldn't believe the facts of the case. So I reached out to Sean, told him about it, and we both kind of naively and foolishly said, "Hey, what if we made a documentary about this?" We had never done this. I had never done anything TV related. Sean had this TV show, but had never done a movie, but he had the production ability. And through that partnership, that led to us first doing A Murder in the Park, which ultimately I think was a big reason why Al Story Simon got exonerated for the double murder he had pled guilty to.
Wow, there's so much there. But first of all, I just want to say a theme on dialogue is guests who followed their curiosity. And it's always my favorite thing to hear of people's firsthand accounts of doing that, because you just never know where it will lead.
I talk about this all the time. My kids are always laughing because I'll just talk to people.
Yeah.
I'll reach out to people, and I think your curiosity and your imagination and connecting with people can open so many doors for you and lead to things. I would have never thought I would be sitting here talking to you about documentary movies, right? But because of this way this kind of went,
here we are.
Here we are. Exactly.
I love it too. I appreciate it so much. So just in the things you've told me so far, you have a law practice that represents cops in Chicago. You've also advocated for the wrongly convicted. Those things could be at tension with each other to some people.
Right. Yeah, and I've had this conversation with many people, and sometimes I'll say, people kind of look at me like that is inconsistent. I look at that like there is absolutely nothing inconsistent about supporting Black Lives Matter, which I do, and supporting good law enforcement, which I do. Those go hand in hand.
Amen.
And I don't know why people act like you have to pick sides. If I support Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean I don't support law enforcement. And when I say support law enforcement, I obviously mean the good law enforcement. And so I think those two things are absolutely consistent. We have historically represented Chicago police officers in civil cases. And I've now developed this practice more recently where I represent people wrongfully convicted, and I'm trying to help people get out of prison, And I think those things, both things involve justice, Justice applies to anybody. It just depends on the facts of the case.
I couldn't agree more. I always say if it's not justice for all, it's not justice. And that has to carry over from the law enforcement to the wrongly convicted to somebody accused until we know, which is really difficult to do. The benefit of innocence is a tough one. I'm watching the jury selection right now for Officer Chauvin's trial, and the jurors are having a hard time presuming him innocent until he's proven guilty. You can hear it in their interviews with the judge, and I think it's hard for many of us who saw what we saw.
I think that's very true. When you have something that was, we all saw the video. I mean, it was tough to watch. Maybe there's people that didn't see the video, but I think especially if you lived in Minneapolis area, you saw it. And with all the media attention it got, it is tough to, go through that jury selection process. But I think what people have to be open to, when the lawyers will flush this out in jury selection, is, can you listen to the evidence presented from both sides with an open mind?
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. Everybody's seen the video. You can't erase that necessarily. But if you're willing to listen to both sides and be fair, that's really all you can ask.
Yeah. I'm amazed at how many people are candidly just looking at the judge and saying, "No, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I can't." It's blowing me away, honestly. I appreciate their honesty. Well,
that's what you want.
Absolutely.
That's what you want. Yeah.
Right. You don't want someone sliding in there who has an agenda and says they're going to do that. And that's where the art of your profession comes in, where lawyers have to really be reading this person and trusting that they're going to do what they say they can do.
Jury selection is really hard. Oftentimes, you don't get much time to really engage with the jurors, but you really need to have a genuine conversation. I'll have cases where I'll say, look, it's a police involved shooting or whatever it might be. And I'll say, let's just talk about it. Let's talk about it. Who's seen it in the paper? Who's bothered by it? And you just have to get people comfortable with this. And I say there's no wrong answer.
Right.
It's okay to say what you feel. In fact, you're supposed to say what you feel. The worst thing you can do is have a juror, either side, whether it's pro plaintiff or pro defendant, who has basically checked out the whole trial, has made up their mind day one, and is the person that's not even paying attention, falling asleep. That's the part that you have to avoid, because both sides deserve to have people who will have an open mind.
100%.
That's our system.
Yeah, that's terrifying. And that's kind of why I think if I was ever in trouble, I've said this before, I'm choosing a bench trial.
I've heard a lot of people say that.
I just don't trust humans.
Yeah. I say that after the trials I lose. Yeah. I'm like, oh my gosh, what were those jurors thinking?
Yeah, exactly. They're brilliant if you win.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you have a lot of practice areas, and one of them is also a civil rights component. I've been on your firm's website, and you have videos that really are. It looks like you're putting yourself out there as a firm who wants to represent people who have been wrongly accused or convicted. So where did that passion come from? Has that been a longstanding conviction for you, or has that evolved?
What really changed my life was when we made the documentary Murder in the Park about L. Story Simon. And, I saw this case where this guy was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And I saw the power that our documentary had in shining a light on that injustice.
To free a wrongfully convicted man 48 hours away from being executed has got to be the great dream of any reporter anywhere.
There was one problem, though. It was one big lie.
A bunch of kids who had taken a course on journalism dug up the information that was there available to the police.
We went and we reenacted the crime, and we found out that the eyewitness couldn't have seen it at all.
They were heroes.
The case was a pivotal moment in the abolition of the death penalty in Illinois.
I'm commuting the sentence of all death row inmates.
I said, there's something going on, but what's going on is not what you see on TV.
The journalism professor intentionally leaves out the most important fact of all.
They seized on the name of a guy with no evidence and concluded he was the real killer.
He tells me that a man is getting ready to die for something I did.
She told us that she had been there when her husband committed the crime.
I heard 2 gunshots.
Totally inconsistent. The victims were shot 5 times.
How many shots did you hear?
Really 3, maybe 4, I don't know.
This case had a motive behind it bigger than the crime.
I was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
These guys are saying they'll help me get out of prison. They'll say whatever they want me to say.
We got the right guy.
Anthony Porter killed those 2 people.
It's an utter outrage. It's justice upside down.
What would make this right is my freedom.
And then to see him walk out of prison after 16 years was so emotional and powerful to me. And then I became friends with him, and I still am, talk to him quite frequently. That really opened my eyes. And then what happened after that was, and this goes back to your point about creating opportunities. So he says to me when he gets out, and bear in mind, at this point, my practice is primarily defense side, city of Chicago police officers. He says, can you look into my best friend's case? His name is Cleve Heidelberg. He's innocent too. And I pull up the appellate court opinion, and I see Cleve Heidelberg, of all things, was convicted of shooting and killing a Peoria, Illinois police officer. And I'm like, oh God, could it have been anything but a police officer shooting, right? And so I was a little reluctant to kind of jump into that, but I did as a favor to Al Story because I just care about him so much. And the more I dug, the more I was convinced that this guy had nothing to do with the case. Fast forward again, 2 years later, 3 years later, I fought like a dog for 2-3 years. And we finally got his conviction vacated, and he walked out of prison after 47 years.
Gosh.
So that really, and my friendship with him over that time with Cleve Heidelberg, who then, after he got out, 10 months later, he died in his sleep, which was sad, but also he died free. But where I'm going with all this is that personal connection to a person wrongfully convicted changed me in a way where I felt it. I could feel that injustice because of that personal connection. And that just made me want to, especially I've been doing this a long time. And as you get older, I think you get wiser and you want to spend your time in a way that you think is the most valuable to you personally, whatever that might be. And I just wanted to spend more time helping people who I believed were wrongfully convicted. And when I say that, I've defended cases where somebody may have been claiming they were wrongfully convicted and they weren't. I have experience on both sides. So I think I'm a pretty good judge of the cases I think have merit. And so that's what led me to develop this kind of civil rights wrongful conviction practice.
Wow, that is fascinating. So do you engage innocence organizations to help you vet potential wrongfully convicted people? Or is this something just your firm does?
It's happened organically. So what happened was after Cleve Heidelberg, who came to me through L. Story Simon, after we got his conviction vacated, which I actually think may be the longest conviction to be vacated in the country.
That's a very, very long time.
It's definitely up there, 47 years. So then I had people write me letters. I still have people write me letters all the time, people in prison. And I vet those, myself and with our team that I work with. And, we're very selective for a couple of reasons. One, I just want to make sure that, it's a case I could be passionate about. And two, these cases take a colossal amount of work and effort. So it's not like, even if 10 people came to me today, I couldn't do 10 cases right now. I mean, every case is like a full-time job. I mean, and the part I struggle with is trying to run my daily practice and also trying to do the wrongful conviction work. So, I basically will investigate these myself and with people I work with, and that's how we do it.
I can imagine that in the scenarios where you're trying to look into a case of a wrongfully incarcerated person, that there's no retainer, that you're doing that on your own time, which is why you kind of have to moonlight and do this on your off hours so that your practice can support this other work.
Right. So I think what's a little unusual is, I don't think there's that many firms out there that are really doing what I'll call the post-conviction work, which means a person's in prison.
Yeah.
Trying to prove their innocence. You've got a lot of great organizations, innocence projects set up that do that. Most of your private firms that handle these cases take them after the person's conviction's vacated and it's turning into a lawsuit. So let's say there's an innocence project, the Illinois Innocence Project, and they were able to get a conviction vacated. They don't actually litigate the cases. They will then find a lawyer who can take it and, pursue it as a civil suit,
Right.
But I'm doing the work, in the post-conviction stage where I'm trying to help the person get out of prison.
Yeah.
And that may or may not lead to a lawsuit. A person could be wrongfully convicted where there's no misconduct. It was just perhaps witness misidentification, an innocent mistake, faulty testimony. There's all kinds of reasons a person could get wrongfully convicted. But what has really hit home to me is the notion of being in prison for something you didn't do. And I fully understand how hard it is to prove your innocence. If somebody came in the studio right now, grabbed you and said, "Hey, that's the woman that stole my baby out of the stroller in the park," and she picked you out of a lineup, you may think, "Oh, okay, I'm going to be able to, beat this. I'm going to be able to prove that I didn't do this." Not so fast. If she picks you out of a lineup and says, "That's the person right there," you are in a very, very difficult spot. And it's hard to unwind a conviction.
Yes, and it's so easy. I mean, I guess this is arguable, but to get one. And we really rely on that just the witness identification. And that seems to be a lot of common. It's common for that to play a role in these wrongful convictions where someone just got it wrong.
I'll give you a real life story of a case that I was involved with. There was a woman, this is back, a while ago. She was downtown Chicago, walking to her garage, her car in a parking garage. A guy grabbed her, threw her in the back seat, raped her. He then opened the trunk, threw her in the trunk of the car, and he tried to drive her car out of the parking garage. Okay. He was an African-American guy. As he pulled up to the parking booth, the reason I say this is I'm going to talk about the racial identification component. Sure. He pulls up to the parking booth, and there's two parking lot attendants there. They recognize the woman's car because she's a monthly parker, and they see that she's not the one driving it. So they don't open the gate. The driver gets out, he walks a few steps, and then he runs, okay? The two parking lot attendants were also African-American. They wind up doing a sketch for the police of what the what the driver looked like. The woman who got raped was so traumatized she couldn't really describe him. So there's a police sketch that's passed around, at roll call to all the officers. There's a guy brought into the station because he looks like the sketch, and the two parking lot attendants pick him out of the lineup. And they testify trial, the guy gets convicted. Fast forward 26 years, DNA is tested, because this happened like in the early 80s. DNA is tested, comes back to a serial rapist, and the guy is set free. So, and the reason I said they're all African-American is, it wasn't a case where some people, there's some studies that say it's harder to do a cross-racial identification. These people were all the same, were all African-American. So that part, and they still got it wrong.
Yeah.
And even though they had the ability to pay attention and were suspicious, and, it wasn't like a fleeting moment for like 1 second, they saw him drive up. So it is it's the leading cause of DNA exonerations. It's typically witness misidentification. And I think what we've learned now as a society is, that a lot of times we need more evidence.
Right.
Because we know witnesses can get it wrong, which we didn't know that back, in 1982.
Right.
As much.
Right. So what you're speaking to suggests there's less of a racial implication in this. It's more of a human fallibility.
Right. Exactly. So, there's been a lot of studies on this. If somebody to run in your studio right now and grab something off your desk, okay, or they've done these in college classrooms. Somebody will run in, grab the professor's laptop, and then run out. And then they'll ask the students to all write down a description of the person. It varies,
I'm sure,
wildly,
yeah,
from height to weight to what the person looked like. Some people are good at remembering those details, and some people are not. And then you also have the factors of the circumstance, the length of time, the stress involved, and whatnot. But witness misidentification, that's a real issue. And if you're caught in that trap, and somebody's at trial pointing at you and saying, no, that is the person that did this. How do you overcome that?
Yeah, that's very, very hard. I want to get into the films, but before I do, just one more question around the work you do. I would imagine you have a good relationship with the police department in Chicago, since you've represented them in different cases. So are there conversations between you and them about your work, trying to help exonerate people? And is that a tough conversation, or are they receptive? Do they understand?
So some of my clients that I've gotten to be close with, I have talked about it, and I think they totally understand, because here's the thing: any hardworking, good police officer is just as upset about some bad police officer as you and I would be. Probably more so, because you're tainting the office and you're tainting the whole department. What I always say is, Chicago has about 13,000 police officers.
Wow.
Okay. 10% is 1,300, so 1% is 130. So if you've got 130 bad apples out there, okay, they can do a lot of, create some bad situations, but it's 1%. And what's unfortunate is it overshadows all the hardworking good ones. And I'm a firm believer, because I've met so many police officers. The vast majority are great, have the best intentions. They're there to protect and serve, and they do a great job. And it's like any profession, you're going to have some that fall through the cracks and are in it for the wrong reasons and are bad apples, And what we have to do a better job of is identifying the bad apples and getting rid of them. If somebody has a pattern of misconduct, we can't just let it pile up. We've got to there's got to be accountability, right? Yeah. But so to go back to your point, those conversations, I think, those clients have understood, what I'm doing, and they know the passion I have, and they understand that. And so it's all good. It's been all good.
I'm encouraged to hear that. So let's talk about the one that I watched, because I'm in the series on documentaries. The one I did get to see, which I loved, was White Boy Rick. And I felt like I knew the loose details of it, but I certainly did not know the story as it is told in this documentary, which, again, so good. Talk to me about how you came in contact with this story. Maybe lay out a little bit of the story for our listeners.
Rick Wershey was a young kid growing up in Detroit. At 14, he was recruited to be an FBI informant. At 17, he was arrested for selling drugs. And at the time, there was a law on the books that if you had over, I think it's 650 grams of, drugs, you got a life sentence without parole. He was 17. So he was a juvenile, nonviolent drug offender, and he got a life sentence without parole. That law was struck down not too long after Rick got convicted. I think within 10 years maybe, but he had been sentenced under it. So it's really a story about, kind of the war on drugs. How could a juvenile at 17 for a nonviolent drug offense get life in prison when there's people killing people and murdering people that are doing 20 years, 15 years? And I think there's so many levels to that movie about how do we treat juveniles? How do we treat drug offenders? His role being recruited by the FBI to be an informant at 14, the craziness of that, how he was kind of used and abused by the FBI and then kicked to the curb. And of course, then he just kind of resorted to the only lifestyle he knew. And it's an incredible story. There's so much to it.
There's so much to it. It's almost, there's themes. There's lots of themes. So let's start with how he got to be selected to be an FBI informant, because that's not a common thing for a teenage kid.
The Wershey family lived in a poor part on the east side of Detroit. And so they lived in an area where, there was a lot of drug sales going on,
right.
And so the way it's first started out was because Rick's dad was actually a big entrepreneur. So the FBI first met with Rick's dad at a McDonald's. And when they were asking questions about certain people in the neighborhood that were selling drugs, Rick, the 14-year-old, was the one kind of whispering in his dad's ear about who was who. And then the FBI agent soon realized, look, it's the kid that really's got the information, because Rick's the one out there, out and about in the neighborhood. And so then the FBI recruits Rick to be an informant. And I think the part in the movie that's incredible is when he talks about, I think he was 15. There was the famous boxing match for boxing fans, Tommy Hearns, Marvin Hagler in Las Vegas. They fly Rick as a 15-year-old out to Vegas. They give him a fake ID. They give him money, and they want him to get information because all these Detroit drug dealers were going out to Vegas for this fight. They want him to do like an intel mission out there. But think about that. Sending a 15-year-old out there with a fake ID and $1,000 in his wallet. The whole part about the FBI informant is incredible. And then, he wound up giving the FBI a lot of powerful information, not only about drug dealers, but about corruption in the Detroit Police Department and in the political world in Detroit. And that was a big part about why Rick didn't get parole the first time he was up. All the politics involved with that, because Rick had basically cooperated to expose a lot of the corruption going on in the city of Detroit.
We're gonna look like businessmen delivering packages.
Money, money, money!
Only us and you will know it's drugs. Okay.
Anybody who's in possession of over 650 grams of cocaine, mandatory life.
White boy Rick. His name is Richard Wershey Jr.
I was like, who was this white kid, you know, that was supposedly running all these black gangs and running the city of Detroit?
When you're 17 years old and you're moving kilos, you're at a status of drug dealer that most 17-year-olds don't reach.
Why would a juvenile, nonviolent drug offender be kept in prison beyond 29 years?
I found out that the reality was much different than the legend.
And I knew that there were corrupt police officers involved in this thing.
Coleman Young is the most powerful politician in the history of Detroit, and his niece was Kathy Volson, and she was married to Johnny Curry, one of the biggest drug dealers in Detroit.
Every police officer down at 1300 was crooked.
If you're a criminal, I would advise you never to get a nickname.
So they said, we got to kill that white boy.
Law enforcement created almost the perfect criminal.
The war on drugs is over, and drugs won.
There's still a lot of angry people in the city of Detroit, in positions of power.
I did way more than he could possibly have done to get that kind of a sentence.
Third world countries don't incarcerate like this.
You're not trying to tell me that you're an angel, that you never did anything wrong, right?
I've been involved in wrongdoing, but I don't feel I did anything to receive a life sentence.
It's an incredible story, and there's, like I said, there's so much to it.
Today's episode is presented by The Skin Store. For over 20 years, The Skin Store has been the #1 destination for premium skincare, hair care, and beauty products. With over 8,000 different products from 300 different brands, The Skin Store has you covered for all your hair, cosmetics, supplements, and of course, skincare needs. Find your favorite brands like Elta MD, NuFace, Olaplex, and more all in one place with gifts with every purchase. I have to tell you, my skin is so sensitive, I had to go to my dermatologist for testing to find out what I was allergic to and what I can and cannot have in the products I use. I was so excited to learn the Skin Store has all the brands my dermatologist recommended, so I can safely and confidently shop there knowing everything I'm going to choose is going to be okay for me. Right now, the Skin Store is offering Dialogue listeners 20% off your next purchase by using the code POD. That's an easy code, right? POD, P-O-D, for 20% off your next purchase. Just go to skinstore.com/pod.list. That's skinstore.com/pod.list. Skin Store. Have the confidence to tackle the day ahead. Some exclusions may apply. Would you classify Rick Wershey's case as a wrongful conviction, or is it more a wrongful sentencing?
I classify it more of an injustice.
Okay.
And the injustice being the sentencing. Let's just take somebody who has a nonviolent drug offense. They should not have a life sentence without parole.
Yeah.
There's other ways we have to deal with drug offenses rather than just locking somebody up for the rest of their life. That doesn't do anybody any good, you know? There's got to be a better way to deal with that. Then when you combine the fact that the person is a juvenile, it's just insane to me that you would give a 17-year-old a life sentence without parole, you know? I think people sometimes are quick to jump to the viewpoint of like I'm soft on crime or something. No, I want to be realistic about what's the best solution. So if let's just talk about a drug offense, you know, putting somebody behind bars for, in Rick's case, years, what does that accomplish? We got to spend more resources on the root of the problem. Right. And then when people do, you know, commit offenses, rather than spend all this money on incarceration and housing, what about programs and job training and other things like this that we can do? So I think his case it just exposed a flawed system, even to have a law like that on the books. Rick and I have talked a lot about prison reform issues. He and I want to try to work on some things to bring some prison reform issues in terms of sentencing, in terms of the quality of the prisons, and more ways to help people stay out of prison when they get out. And so, it's the word I would use is injustice.
It's remarkable that he's out just recently, as of last year, right?
Right. Right.
That he's out and able to think that way and be willing to think that way.
Oh, if you met him, you would never believe that this is a guy who spent over 30 years in prison. He's so thoughtful. He's so smart. He's got the biggest heart of anybody you'll meet. He now is in Detroit, and every weekend he's helping out at food banks. He's, raising money for people for food drives. And it's a person that really wants to give back and help basically people that grew up in environments like him.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And so I think we could do so much more with helping people become people like Rick Wershey, and he's doing so much good now. And he would have just been rotting away in a prison cell and would have died in prison, and that's the crazy part, to think that, he got a life sentence without parole, that he could have spent the rest of his life there.
And what's the legal rule or the law when that happens? When a law changes and someone's already convicted, is there no retroactive ability to resentence? Is that just like your grandfathered in, sort of?
Typically, that's the case. I'll give you another example. So I met a woman here in Chicago area who's doing some great work, named Jennifer Sobel, who runs the Illinois Prison Project. There was a law in the books at one time, the 3 strikes law, where if you got 3 felonies within, I think just 3 felonies, you got life in prison. Yeah. And so she has been very successful in helping a lot of very elderly Illinois inmates get released, got a life sentence for maybe 3 armed robberies over the course of 10 years. I mean, there was a client, she got out 3 armed robberies. No gun was never fired. No blood was ever shed.
Right.
There were 3 armed robberies. The person got a life sentence and had served 36 years in prison and got out in their mid-70s. So that was an example where the 3 strikes law was, no longer on the books, but the people that got convicted on it still remain, And so I think we went through a period of time where maybe the intentions were good, but there were a lot of laws passed that all it led to was just mass incarceration, and mass incarceration is not the answer.
Right. And we also know this, not so much in robberies, but in the drug world, that addiction has not gone down. The buying of drugs has not gone down. In fact, it continues to grow. So it's obviously not a working solution.
Right.
So it's just time to rethink all of it from the ground up.
Right. And I think we need political leaders that are willing to make change. I think unfortunately with politics, and I don't want to get too political here, but no matter what party you're in, a person gets elected and then all they start to care about is, I got to get reelected.
Yeah.
So they get elected. If you're in the House of Representatives, you're running every 2 years, you got to ramp up again to fundraise. And people aren't willing to take the risk of saying, you know what, I'm going to tackle prison reform. It's probably not going to be popular with my constituents, but I think it's the right thing to do. I would love to see more politicians say, look, I'm one term. I'm going to do one term, and I'm going to do what I think is best. And I'm going to make some change. Whatever your issue might be, gun violence, prison reform, poverty, minimum wage, helping businesses, whatever it might be, job growth. But I just think right now, we don't have enough leaders who are trying to be problem solvers. We got people that just want to remain in power and want to stay there and are not willing to take the risk of doing something that is right and that's going to benefit people because they're worried they might not get reelected.
Absolutely. I would love to see a sea change and to see that be the new normal. Again, maybe what happened, the divisiveness of 2020 will compel new leaders to think differently and to do things differently. It'd be really interesting.
But I mean, think about it. You know what's depressing to me? Think about it. We passed the Civil Rights Act in the mid 60s. We passed that.
Right.
We passed a bipartisan bill like that. Can you imagine? I mean, that would never pass today. There's no way that would pass today. And, in that sense, that's the part that is really sad to me, is like some of this big stuff that we passed in the 60s. Right now, it's like people don't work together. It's like, if you want it, I'm against it.
The chasm is so big right now, and so polarized. Yeah. It's really sobering when you say it like that. For Murder in the Park, and I'm always curious about this in wrongful conviction cases, did the appropriate suspect ever get apprehended? Did the person who did it get caught?
So in the Murder in the Park, no. What was crazy about a Murder in the Park is a person originally got convicted of the double murder. And then through all these crazy circumstances, L. Story Simon wound up pleading guilty to the murder that he didn't commit. Right. And that allowed the person that got convicted to get released from prison when, in my opinion, they shouldn't have been. They were properly convicted. So in that case... Oh,
somebody had already been sentenced for the murder?
Somebody got convicted of the double murder. L. Story Simon falsely confessed to it. And then he winds up going into prison, and the person that was convicted came out. And then ultimately, 16 years later, L. Story Simon, the Cook County State's attorney, vacated his conviction and released him, and he got exonerated. And our movie, A Murder in the Park, I think was a big part of shining a light on the injustice that had happened to L. Story Simon.
And so the original person sentenced couldn't be tried again.
Because of double jeopardy, the original person could not go back to prison. Correct.
Gotcha.
Right.
Wow. So they.
Right.
Wow.
So some wrongful conviction cases, I mean, I think in most, this Murder in the Park was super unique. I mean, there's just nothing like it that I'm aware of.
Wild.
It's just the craziest thing I've ever heard of. But in most of your cases, a person's wrongfully convicted. And if they're exonerated, then, sometimes like with DNA, sometimes it's matched up to the real perpetrator. Other times it's not, and that it's just an unsolved case, because I'm also very interested in cold cases, where I work on a case file TV show and trying to help solve unsolved murders.
And those are especially challenging for a number of reasons, especially with a long passage of time. But when there was a case of a wrongful conviction prior, sometimes the state or law enforcement are reluctant to reopen it if they thought the right guy had been in jail for it. I've seen that happen a couple of times where they're just not following new leads and tips.
Well, I've seen this firsthand too in some of my cases where we've approached, the local state's attorney's office to investigate the case, and they're just not interested.
Exactly.
A state's attorney's job is to seek justice. Yep. That's their mandate, to seek justice, whatever that might be. It is not to just preserve a conviction. It's not just to preserve, a win for the office. And so I think another change that has to happen is we have to have more state's attorneys who understand that their job is to seek justice. And if there has been an injustice and there's been a wrongful conviction, yes, it's obviously going to be an issue, but we have to hold people accountable. We have to admit mistakes. We have to correct the injustices. And that's the job of a state's attorney's office. We can't be afraid to do that work.
Absolutely. This comes up a lot. And conviction integrity units.
I was just about to say that. You took the words out of my mouth.
I want them to be everywhere in every office.
Yes.
Those should not be exceptions,
The first start is to have
one.
So most jurisdictions, probably don't.
Right.
Your bigger cities do. But then the second step, which is just as important, is you have to staff it with people that have an open mind, that are open to being fair and following the truth wherever it may lead you. Sometimes you may conclude the person was correctly convicted. Right. Sometimes you may conclude they were not. But you have to have people that will fairly and honestly take a look at the case. And I've dealt with that firsthand. I've gone to state's attorney, I went to state's attorney's office, and I gave them all my witnesses. They didn't even talk to them. They wouldn't even talk to my witnesses. I mean, think about that. It's not like they came back and said, we talked to your witnesses, Andy. We just don't think they're credible. They didn't even talk to them. You have to have a real interest in taking a look at wrongful convictions, because there's nothing worse than having a person who is in prison that shouldn't be there.
Couldn't agree more. And you also have to have a humility, I think. The office has to have a
Right.
humility. And I think sometimes that is what I see lacking. And that really is pretty devastating to witness.
That is true.
For White Boy Rick, here I am back again, switching movies. How did you get such access to Rick himself and to all the drug dealers at the time who went to prison and were out by the time, Rick Wershey, meanwhile, is still there? I mean, the stories are so wild. It's crazy.
I mean,
how did you get that?
Sean Reck, who was my partner for Murder in the Park, who directed it and put the whole thing together, he just reached out to everybody, and you got these people amazingly to cooperate and just tell the story, which it's the people that make up the story. Yes. So to get people like, especially what Johnny Curry was talking about, how he was this major drug dealer, and he got out after he got a 20-year sentence. I think he said he got out after
13 or something, 12.
Yeah, like 13. Right. And Nate Boone Kraft, said he had killed like 30 people. He got out of prison, and I think that really kind of proved the point. Yes. But a good documentary, it's the people, and you've got to just, again. You'd be surprised at who will talk if you reach out, right? Just to try to say, hey, we're telling this story. We'd like to tell it from all sides. Would you like to be a part of it?
Absolutely. Asking is key. I mean, it's the way I started this podcast, and people have said, yes, it's incredible. But that is what I'm blown away every time. But that is what makes that story so amazing. There's so much color to it because of the unique personalities who are all directly related, right? You've got the political figures, and really, really good. So what am I remembering about his dad selling guns?
His dad did sell guns, like at gun shows, and he sold silencers and things.
So on the up and up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm so naive that I hear selling guns. I assume it's like out of a trunk or a back alley. Okay.
I mean, right. The Wersheys, like many families, lived in a very poor part of town, and themselves didn't have a lot of money. And that's the environment Rick grew up in. And I saw this a lot with my Case File Chicago TV show. We try to solve these unsolved murders. I'd meet these families, mothers, brothers, sisters, and they'd come in to tell about the victim, right? About who was shot. And I felt so bad for them because, they just live where they live because that's where they were. Right. They couldn't afford to be somewhere else. I can't tell you how many times mothers said to me, I just wanted to make sure he came home that night. Like, I didn't want him to go to the corner store. When my son was in high school, there was not one single time that I thought to myself, boy, I hope he makes it home tonight. And these mothers struggled with this every time their son or daughter left the house. So my point of all this is there's a lot of good people that live in bad neighborhoods. And I am so sympathetic to that, and they grow up in an environment of so much violence,
And that's another topic that you seem to have a passion for and have focused on, some of your work on gun violence, specifically in Chicago, I saw.
Yes. Because of our TV show, I mean, it really hit me. I think a lot of times people just assume that the gun violence issue in Chicago is just gangbanger A shooting gangbanger B. And what they don't realize is, and then they kind of check out like, oh, well, who cares?
Right.
They don't realize how many people are affected by gun violence. So many people getting shot who are innocent victims. We've had so many episodes of our TV show where they were children. A girl sitting in her living room, bullet goes through the window. Somebody walking down the street, they're trying to shoot the guys down the block, but they just kind of spray gunfire, and then random people get hit. And I think because I met these families, and I wish everybody could have a personal connection like that, because I think we'd have a much different view of gun violence. And unfortunately, most people just don't. And so it's not on their radar screen. It doesn't really resonate. Yeah. But if you would have met one of these families or knew somebody who lost a son or daughter, you would look at it in a whole different light.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of things. It remains very abstract until you're confronted with something personally. And, you know, when you met somebody who was wrongfully convicted and then saw their life on the outside after, and the trauma and all the re-entry and everything that goes with that, that changes you. And for a lot of people, it changes their perspective and shifts things.
Yeah. I mean, I really wish for a lot of our political issues, I really wish there was a way to kind of connect people more with, I mean, I even think of like poverty, right? It's very easy to go about your day. You're busy, you go to work, you know, you come home, you have dinner, you talk to your family. You're not taking a little break to wonder like, gosh, you know, there's people out there who are really, really struggling. I just wish there was a way to get more of a personal connection for everybody with a lot of these issues so that they could really see it and feel it. Because I think if they did, I think we would have so much more engagement to try to make change. And I'm not saying, you know, people aren't bad people for not doing it. It's just not on your radar screen. And I just wish there was a way to raise awareness and have people more engaged and to kind of see the other side of things, right?
Well, is that why you're making films now? I mean, it seems like you've answered that for yourself. That's something you can do, right? Put that in the world.
Yeah. You know, I'm trying to do what I can. So even with the gun violence, you know, the TV show was a big part of it. And we still have, you know, we have a called Case Files Chicago that has all the videos up there, and you can see the profiles of all the different people. So we still have that to get engagement, trying to solve these cases. We made a short documentary. It's about a half hour. It's on our website, halemonaco.com. You could watch it there for free, called Bullets Have No Names. That title came from one of the kids in the documentary, meaning a bullet can hit anybody. And so we highlight some kids in the documentary. We highlight a detective. We highlight a pastor who's very involved in the gun violence issue. We also have a gallery on our website. There's a really talented illustrator locally here in Chicago, Sherry Damra, who she actually became very well known for her George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery illustrations, her tributes.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got a gallery for that. Trying to raise awareness that it affects so many people. It doesn't just affect the person that got shot. And I think changing the mindset too of these neighborhoods where people have to live. Neighborhoods might have, and I've gone to a lot of these neighborhoods for my cases to interview witnesses and things. You know, you've got one bad house, right, where maybe there's some bad stuff going on. The rest of the block are all good people that unfortunately live on the block with that other house, you know?
Do you think for all the terrible things that have happened to us in 2020 during this pandemic, do you think maybe there's been an opening in people's awareness about the suffering and the inequality? And because we've all had to slow down and go home, those of us that have been able to, right? Because that's a privilege in and of itself, even though we're all sick of it. Do you think we're better positioned to maybe engage with the suffering in our country?
I don't know. I think yes, in the sense that I almost feel like you got to get to the bottom and still you can kind of dig your way out. And I feel like we went down a few levels in 2020, but I think now that we are at a point where we got to start climbing back up now. So I kind of feel like with a lot that happened in 2020, it was rough, but I do think it's provided an opportunity to hopefully make positive change and grow from it and make positive steps in a number of different facets, you know? So I think the foundation is there. We'll see if we can get the follow through.
So are you saying America hit rock bottom?
I kind of feel like we did.
I do too.
At least in my lifetime.
Yeah. No, the way you're describing
I feel
it.
like in my lifetime, you know, when you combine the pandemic with some of the high profile police incidents and I think incidents of racism that we saw and continue to see.
Political conflicts.
And I think, you know, what we saw with that, what we saw on January 6th, I think we hit rock bottom. I really do. And I think we're just now starting to heal. And I do think one of my other big quotes I always say is everything in life is an opportunity, meaning as bad as something might be, it's an opportunity now for something new and more improved and better. So as bad as 2020 was, I do think it's creating an environment to build on and to make things better 2021 and going forward. Hopefully we can do that, because I am a huge optimist.
Yeah.
I am a huge optimist.
I think you would have to be if you're working on things that you're working on, which can seem very hopeless to somebody without a hopeful perspective. I think you have to be optimistic. So I'd love to know if there's something you're working on or want to work on. I know there not a lot of creative production work could happen in the last year, but is there a story you're hoping to tell again through film?
Yeah, there's actually two that are in the works right now. So one is about our Cleve Heidelberg case.
Oh, good.
Cleve Heidelberg, we filmed. What's really going to be great about that is we were filming as we went through the process to try to prove his innocence. So, we didn't know where this was going to take us, but we were going to just document it. And we filmed that whole process, and that's in post-production. I'm hoping it'll be finished by the end of the year. That one's called Wrong Cat. And it's just going to tell this tale of Cleve Heidelberg, getting convicted in 1970 in Peoria of shooting a police officer, black guy for convicted shooting a white police officer, the racial implications of the 70s, what that was like at the time of the crime, leading up to our whole post-conviction process to get him out of prison, and ultimately culminating with him getting out of prison. And then there's another one I'm working on that is actually going to be a big documentary. It's going to be out by the end of the year. I can't say where yet, but it's going to be, I think, pretty powerful. I'm representing a guy named Chester Weger, who was convicted in 1960. Let me say that again, 1960, of something called the Starved Rock murders. You'll have to Google that.
Okay.
He served over 60 years in prison. He just got out on parole last year. I believe he's innocent.
How old is he?
And he just turned 82.
Ooh.
I heard about the Chester Weger case because it just reminded me so much of the Cleve Heidelberg case. So there's a documentary being made now about Chester Weger and the Starved Rock murders, which was 3 women who were bludgeoned to death in a state park in Illinois in 1960. It was actually a national news story back then. It was in Life magazine. For those of us who remember Life magazine, it's a really fascinating case. There was a false confession. And so it touches on a lot of interesting things. And I think even more incredibly, when Chester Weger went to trial in 1961, it was prior to 2 landmark Supreme Court cases. In the 1960s, we decided Brady versus Maryland, which said the prosecutors, the state, has to turn over any potentially exculpatory information. And then Miranda versus Arizona, which basically you get your Miranda rights. You get told that you're entitled to an attorney. If you can't afford one will be appointed. So think about this. Chester Weger went to trial at a time when the prosecutors did not even have to give him exculpatory information. Can you imagine that system?
No, because we have it now, and still sometimes they don't do it. But when it wasn't even on the radar or the books, it's like the Wild West. So I'm so excited for these. So before I let you go, what gets you up in the morning? And this can be literal or figurative or both.
You know what gets me up in the morning, and it also keeps me up at night, it does both, is the clients that I'm working for where I'm trying to prove their innocence. I will feel guilty if I'm not kind of spending every waking moment trying to do something to push the ball forward. I've got a couple of these in the works. I've got another one I didn't talk about. Guy that was convicted of a double murder here in the Chicago area has been in prison for 20 years. He got a life sentence. I am very passionate about this one. And I tell him, I said, listen, James, I don't talk to you as much as we can, but know I'm doing something every day to push your case forward. Every day. Know that I'm doing something because, you're just sitting there in yourself. You're wondering, does anybody know about me? Does anybody care about me? Does anybody hear me? I said, just know every day, Andy's doing something. Andy's doing something today. You might not know what it is. So that's what really gets me up and keeps me going. That kind of drive to help some of these clients of mine. But I could talk to you for hours.
Same, Andy. I know. So let me go watch A Murder in the Park. We'll do a part 2, and I'm thrilled you were on Dialogue. Thank you so much for killing the small talk with me. It was great. Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.